Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My talk is going to be somewhat different in that I'm going to take a higher level look at 3 different approaches to the development of point-of-care devices for STIs, but in general for point-of-care testing, and highlight characteristics of each that impact the likelihood of successful adoption or implementation. I won't be speaking specifically about STI interventions or STI technology, since others will be addressing those issues. So point-of-care testing means different things to different people. This is an example of an effort last year that to define point-of-care testing for family practice. In this definition, a point-of-care test is one that must be performed by a qualified member of the practice at a location near the patient during or very close to the time of the consultation, with the results available at the time of clinical decision-making. With STI testing, there's a much wider range of users, settings, methods for delivering the test results, and so for point-of-care, so thinking about point-of-care testing, we can consider anything that goes beyond traditional laboratory testing as being appropriate for this topic. So there has been, I should note, previously I was an NIH program director. I managed a development program for point-of-care technologies at the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. And so there was, at that time, a lot of enthusiasm for development of point-of-care devices, in large part because of the many things that point-of-care testing can do. It can empower healthcare providers to make informed decisions during the patient visit, increasing diagnostic capacity and guiding the delivery of treatments. It can improve healthcare access in remote areas or help with provider shortages. It can facilitate patient self-testing, which we've heard about, a very important aspect of STI testing. And it can also enable new or growing models of delivering care, and I've mentioned a few there. So this belief in the potential has been behind investment in technology development for many decades now. But recently, there's been increasing awareness of, and importantly, I think, an interest in understanding and addressing the many challenges with actually implementing point-of-care testing so the impacts can be realized. There have been several qualitative studies to assess this. There is a poor understanding of clinical needs and end-user perceptions. There is limited evidence of impact of testing on patient outcomes. There's a lack of awareness of test availability. Even when they exist, often providers aren't aware of that, or they don't see the value in those tests. There are, of course, concerns about cost and reimbursement, concerns about the many changes that need to occur to implement point-of-care testing in practice, impacts on the workflow, et cetera. There are concerns, especially from the laboratory community, in the assuring quality and delivering point-of-care testing, and so there's some resistance, I think, from the laboratory community in handing that off to a point-of-care setting. There are, and of course, needs for data connectivity to make sure that the results of point-of-care tests make it into electronic health records. So the consensus now is that there's, or at least the belief now is that the challenges with adoption and implementation are limiting the potential impact of point-of-care testing. So in starting to address these challenges, it's useful to explore 3 different approaches to device development and discuss some aspects that contribute to limitations in the, or challenges with adoption and implementation of these devices. So I'll start with technology-driven. This is the predominant approach to developing new technologies. It's unfortunately also the most commonly used approach. It's the approach that is taken, is most removed from the ultimate clinical application. It is motivated by a desire to push technological capabilities. There's no clinical focus per se in this area, but often developers have a shared understanding of key challenges, and I've listed a few there. One major limitation with this is that developers often avoid using real biological samples just because of the difficulty with obtaining them, the challenges with using them. Unfortunately, this is often a point of failure for device development, so it greatly limits the ability to translate into actual use. Developers are working without clear performance targets. There's a long time horizon for applying these advances toward a clinical application. And career factors can prevent any sustained attempt to solve difficult problems. A lot of this funding is in an academic environment. When challenges are met, often a different pathway is taken just to achieve more career-driven outcomes. I was asked to comment on decision factors that are used in terms of deciding to invest in these technologies. For this area, of course, novelty is a main consideration. The potential to impact a range of applications is a key consideration. Also, diversifying a technology portfolio, making sure you have different approaches to solving a particular problem. And the potential to leverage developments from another field is always of interest. So an improvement on this, and a concept that we started working with about 10 years ago at the NIH, is to take, and of course is used widely in industry, is to take more of a clinical needs-driven approach. It's an obvious consideration, where now the motivation is to desire, is the desire to solve a clinical problem. In this case, the needs that are identified reflect more of a clinical or user perspective. The process of identifying the needs can result in identification of technical specifications, so now developers have clear performance targets. Some limitations and challenges with this approach is that the expressed clinical needs might not really capture all aspects of the clinical problem. They're focused really on the perceptions of clinicians in this case. But of course, the decision makers go beyond that when ultimate adoption decisions are made. The needs assessments often assume that the test is the best solution to the clinical problem. When the provider is making the decision, that person or group might be faced with, might be offered different potential solutions to that problem. And of course, the test might not be the most promising way or easiest way to solve that problem. There's increasing pressure to demonstrate outcomes. Clinical performance isn't enough. This area is focused mostly on demonstrating clinical performance, which might relate to a regulatory type submission. And guiding implementation is very important. It's one thing to solve the clinical need, but then to actually realize that in actual practice requires implementation planning going into the process. Some decision factors that would be used for investing in development: are there detailed enough definitions of clinical needs and technical specifications? Are there appropriate partnerships to ensure access to the clinical samples and study design expertise? A lot of the development is either in academic environments or with small businesses. They often lack access to samples. They lack the clinical expertise to fully complete the development. So partnerships are a very key aspect of success with these types of programs. Importantly, is there a match between the enabling technology and the performance requirements? So often, even though the project gets started from more of a clinical needs perspective, if the technology is selected because it has novelty, then it ends up being pushed more so into the technology-driven area, which then limits its ability to make it into clinical use. And lastly, is there the ability to use the technology platform across other clinical applications, because of course things fail. Recently, there's been a shift in focus to value-based considerations for healthcare delivery and for different payment models. And this is also now being applied to technology adoption decisions and then by extension to device development. In this area, it's motivated by a desire to achieve outcomes. These could be clinical or process or economic for point-of-care testing. Importantly, do those outcomes benefit all stakeholders? We heard in the last talk about the need to incorporate stakeholder needs. It is very much a part of value-based developments for point-of-care testing, in particular for testing where the test just plays a role in the overall care pathway, and so the outcomes and impacts aren't always as obvious as they might be for pharmaceuticals. This approach goes beyond clinical perceptions to consider system-level needs and broad stakeholder perspectives. And context is very important. Value is determined relative to a specific decision context, so defining that context is key to developing essentially a value proposition. Some challenges with this approach: definitions of value vary. It's very resource intensive to work with all these different specific contexts to define value. These concepts are new and evolving as they relate to technology adoption. So a lot has yet to be determined. And the evidence can be very difficult or costly to obtain to support the development of value propositions. So often developers will sort of push back against the evidence requirements that payers or providers might be requesting from them. Some decision factors. Again, this is a relatively new concept. There hasn't been much work in promoting value-based technology development, but some potential factors might be: are there recognized value drivers for the proposed test within the care pathway? Importantly, are there do the adopters have decision processes that will allow them to realize or recognize the value of the technology that's being offered? And these are lacking right now. And is there a clear approach to development of the evidence that is needed to demonstrate value? And it's this last area, these decision factors that can help guide us in thinking about some improvements that are needed in the system to accelerate the process of development to adoption. So from the clinical needs perspective, there's a need to produce and disseminate detailed performance requirements for a range of clinical needs related to STI testing. You know, there's a lot of information out there, but often developers work at sort of the highest level of need and don't really dig down into the details of the actual requirements that might be appropriate for different contexts of use. And importantly, verifying those unmet needs. Again, a lot of these come from researchers. The needs information hasn't necessarily been verified from the perspective of the ultimate provider, at least at an organizational level. Also creating tools to evaluate the devices as early as possible in the development process relative to these needs so that different decisions can be made. Creating more opportunities for collaboration with STI researchers. It's critical for technology developers who, again, often come from small businesses and have little access to this kind of expertise. And creating resources to inform developers about changes to the evidence requirements and appropriate study design. I'll just mention quickly that the regulatory landscape is changing. The FDA is focusing more on advancing innovations, making trials more efficient. They're working through a public-private partnership, Medical Device Innovation Consortium, to release guidance for developers and researchers on what clinical evidence is required now for regulatory as well as coverage decisions. There is an interest in sort of harmonizing those processes and getting developers to produce the evidence earlier in the process to streamline that regulatory coverage transition. In the EU, there are actually several changes underway. They're going more towards stricter evidence requirements, especially for in vitro diagnostics, where a lot of the tests were essentially just self-certified, so most of them didn't have to go through any kind of scrutiny. That is now changing. Most devices will have to go through some kind of regulatory review, and that could have a pretty serious impact on the devices that are cleared for release in the EU over the next several years. This is something that's pending for 2022. Both are essentially starting to harmonize and move in the same direction. Of course, the FDA has always been a bit stricter, and with the EU moving toward more stricter requirements, eventually, we might end up with more harmonized regulatory requirements, which would be helpful for everybody. But developers need a lot of guidance in this respect. And from the value-based perspective, again, it's a highly undeveloped area, so there's a basic need to identify and communicate value drivers for point-of-care STI testing, again, that capture the perspectives of all stakeholders. Developing value frameworks and structured decision processes to support value-based adoption decisions for introducing point-of-care STI tests, and developing tools to assess the likelihood of implementation success and to guide implementation of point-of-care STI testing in high-impact settings. So in general, defining what is the value proposition for STI, point-of-care STI testing. All I'll say about this slide is that in developing a value proposition, there are actually two sides of the issue. Manufacturers are working to create value propositions. They want to demonstrate the value of their product to potential providers. Of course, on the provider and payer side, they are trying to evaluate the value propositions. But of course, these two need to communicate, and that requires developing a shared set of frameworks, criteria for reviewing the devices, and evidence requirements. So there are needs across all of those elements to work on these definitions. There are actually several efforts underway to define value for technology adoption. The International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research has a special task force where they're working on expanding definitions of value beyond traditional cost effectiveness. They feel that doesn't really truly capture value of new technologies, which in this case refers to pharmaceuticals, but they also have an emphasis, or at least they incorporate diagnostics and medical devices in their consideration, and they've released a nice series of papers summarizing some of their views on that. The procurement world is considering value-based approaches to improve on traditional procurement, which is often just cost considerations, maybe performance, but capturing the full spectrum of value for stakeholders, both in the EU and in the US. And in diagnostics, the diagnostics area, there are groups trying to promote frameworks for developing point-of-care devices, and actually there's even one being considered for point-of-care testing. This is the last slide. I'll just leave. I have no affiliation with this program, but it's, I think, an interesting example of a group that is working with developers across the full spectrum of development to adoption, and this is the Mars Excite program in Ontario. They provide developers with an early indication of fit with the healthcare system. They support developers in meeting the evidence requirements for both regulatory and payer coverage decisions. And they focus, they identify conditions of adoption. So they consider what the systematic barriers to adoption might be and how to support system-level changes that will allow implementation to occur. So there's certainly need for this kind of thing in the US as well. It's a little bit more difficult, of course. We have a heterogeneous system, and this is a simpler scenario to work with, but they have at least recognized the problem in bridging that gap, and it's something to consider. So thank you for your time, your attention.